microphone when it's your turn to speak. For our online participants, please use the raise hand function or drop your questions on Q&A box during discussion. Our event is live streamed on Facebook, Nghiên cứu Biển Đông, live streamed on YouTube, South China Sea Connects, and live tweeted via South China Sea Connects. Trước khi bắt đầu thì xin kính mời quý vị đại biểu thì chuyển điện thoại về chế độ yên lặng và quay trở lại chỗ ngồi để chúng ta bắt đầu ạ. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move to our final session, Youth Power, Overcoming Ambiguity, Strengthening Unity. This session is dedicated to the voices and visions of the next generation, the young leaders shaping tomorrow's maritime order. We are honored to have the DAV Power, resident representative from confrontation in Vietnam as moderator. Mr. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. And welcome to the sixth and concluding session of this year's South China Sea Conference. I'm honored to host this panel and to moderate it. It's called Youth Power, Overcoming Ambiguity and Strengthening Unity. First of all, I would like to thank the DAV for emphasizing the role of youth and also the participation of the young leaders in this conference, both from Vietnam and from other countries. And as a long-standing partner of this conference and of the DAV, I would also like to emphasize that the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung very much welcomes the contribution of young scholars to this format, and we believe that you will all have a vital role in shaping the future of this region. And before we start off, I would like to recall the first panel of this conference in which it has been said that we need audacity and innovation to overcome the challenges that the region is facing. And I believe with this panel we can come full circle and actually let our young scholars speak on that, and with audacity and innovation as the spirit guiding this panel. In the last 2 days, I believe we have seen that challenges persist, but that there's also room for constructive action. And this is where the role of youth comes in. So here we will hear creative insights and new approaches to the persisting challenges. We're very honored that 4 young leaders from this year's cohort joined the panel. They all come with significant academic distinctions and achievements. And I think it is fair to say that most questions throughout this conference came from that corner of the room, and I think we can all return the favor now to our young scholars later, and I'm very much looking forward to questions later. So first of all, to my left is Etia Lang with Chatham House in the United Kingdom and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Switzerland. She focuses on territorial and maritime transboundary disputes and maritime mediation. And without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to you, Etia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. Hi everyone, my name is Nitya La. I am with Chatham House, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, but today I'll be speaking in my own personal capacity. My presentation is titled Reimagining Sovereignty in the South China Sea, Comparative, Legal, and Geographic Frameworks. So, to begin, we were given a set of guiding questions as young leaders. The first one, what are the main causes of uncertainty in the South China Sea today? And how should unity be understood? And so in answering the first question, I'm going to be able to answer the second one for you. And so I hope you follow along the presentation. So to the first question, what are the main causes of uncertainty in the South China Sea? I think we have to set a very maybe uncomfortable future truth, that is, geography is changing, and it will continue to change. The current international system is based on the idea that our geography doesn't move, but climate change, technological innovation means that countries can now shape geography to suit their own national interests. Policymakers are beginning to adapt concepts of sovereignty and statehood to address this uncertainty, but that has not really reached the South China Sea yet. So to be more specific about how geography is going to change, I'm going to use a bunch of maritime legal references, and I don't have time to go into them, but I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A, so you know where the basis is for this discussion. First, how is geography going to change? We have to look at sea level rise, storm wave inundation, overwash in the South China Sea. These graphs show how that could progress over time, especially for coastal and littoral regions. What are the consequences of this climate change? Well, first, receding coastlines could create new high seas areas. As seen in this chart, if you look on the first diagram, if two states share a boundary that divides their EEZs or even their territorial seas, be it an equidistant line or the natural boundary that they form, as their coastlines move back as a result of sea level rise, they may not lose 12 nautical miles, they may still have it, but the space between those two grows. And as it does, we create a new area for the high seas that didn't previously exist. Another impact of sea level rise could be that there's a partial loss of maritime zones, not just new high seas, but if an island loses island status, it becomes uninhabited. It's downgraded legally as a rock, or it becomes a low tide elevation. These physical distinctions matter because they generate legal claims based purely on their physical conditions. So this diagram shows the consequences, but they could be much larger. In fact, the future may not change, but if sea level rise does, they might lose their EEZ entitlements altogether. So this sounds pretty radical and pretty scary, but actually climate change is already affecting borders around the world. There are 3 case studies right here. The first is the Pacific Islands, where they've implemented this thing called the Pacific Islands Boundary Project within the Pacific Islands Forum. There's a historic case from the US-Mexico border, and there's also a current-day case on Italy and Switzerland. Here are 2 diagrams that go a little bit more in depth on that. For Italy and Switzerland, they have a border that is drawn upon the ridge line of a glacier. And as that glacier melts, they realize that they have to keep redefining that border. So they have to establish a working group to address climate change and how it impacts their boundaries. The better case for the South China Sea is the Pacific Islands, which is a harbinger for what is to come here. When sea levels rise, island states, if they don't disappear, will lose a lot of territory. And that has really key implications for boundaries, especially because international law has decided that boundaries are ambulatory, meaning that they do move as your coastline moves. There's another way that geography is changing, and I think the one that we're more familiar with, artificial island building and coastal land reclamation. This means that geography won't just change in terms of a reduction or a contraction of space. There will also be additions to geography in the form of islands. Coastal land reclamation also has a climate resiliency angle, and so we can see countries doing this in their littoral regions as well. So what we're going to see is a tension between our legal reality and our geographic reality. Geophysical changes, whether it's sea level rise or artificial island building, do not receive recognition under international law. And I'm not saying that we should acknowledge countries' extraterritorial claims, but international law doesn't provide us a clear guideline or framework about how to engage in this new reality. We have the example of the Pacific Islands Forum Boundaries Project. What they've said is the Pacific Islands for the past 10 years have recognized their boundaries are likely to recede as a result of sea level rise. They've undertaken a project where they want to freeze their baselines, creating what is called fictitious or imaginary baselines. Their baselines or their boundaries are no longer tied to their coastline. Now, there is no precedent for this in international law. In fact, it's not really international law. It's commonly established practice for the Pacific Islands. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything until the other states transiting the waters of these countries also recognize that law. And so common law doesn't necessarily establish practice. The consequences of freezing your baselines mean that when your coastlines move, if your boundaries don't, you have bigger internal waters. First, there's a maritime capacity challenge. Do you have the Coast Guard capabilities to regulate bigger and bigger maritime zones within your own territory? And second, will countries transiting the high seas recognize that your boundaries haven't moved? Or when they have an incentive to maximize their access to the high seas, will they continue to infringe, creating a zone of uncertainty where historic precedent comes into question? Then there's international law when it comes to artificial islands. According to the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal, semi-permanent habitation in the form of troop presences from countries all over on the features of the South China Sea does not count as human habitation, does not grant island status. Now that's fine, but it does not give us a rule or a set of protocols for engagement when it comes to troops at sea. So what happens if there's an accident, if there's a loss of life? We're now operating outside of the boundaries of what international law provides. And the number of meetings that the UN Sixth Legal Committee has had, the International Law Commission, the International Law Association, they've all taken up these questions, and the answer consistently is, we don't know. International law doesn't give us an answer. So from a policy perspective, we need to go beyond the bounds of what we have in frameworks and come up with something new. The question is, how can international law govern what it does not recognize? Solving the South China Sea disputes cannot come from a denial of change in terms of geographic expansion, like island building, or contraction in the form of sea level rise. In response, I offer that we need new legal and political processes to anticipate geographic transformation. New geographies require new concepts of sovereignty. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that this is the way forward, but I want to use this time to sort of experiment and expand the scope of what we think is possible to maybe unlock new combinations or permutations about what policies could be implemented in the future. And so I propose this idea of collective sovereignty and plural authority. There are examples in international law and precedent from other parts of the world that we could try to retrofit here, choosing the best of the agreements that we have and excluding the worst. So example number one is the Inuit Circumpolar Council. It takes on a form of indigenous sovereignty for the Inuit groups that live in the Arctic. They are sort of bounded by the US, Russia, Canada, Denmark, through Greenland, but they transit across these boundaries fluidly as an indigenous group. They don't sit comfortably within the boundaries that have already been drawn. And so they had to establish this council as a way to create their own identity and sovereignty separate from national boundaries, and then coordinate with governments to synchronize policy specifically for their community. Another example is the High Seas Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. This is a recent treaty, but it sets a precedent for international cooperation and collective sovereignty or universal jurisdiction on the high seas when it comes to biodiversity. It doesn't give us a clear pathway for the South China Sea, but it establishes this common understanding that on the high seas, maybe we do all have common interests that grant us the authority to protect things like biodiversity. And so why can't that then give us more of a framework for cooperation on the South China Sea? One that is not bounded by mine versus yours. It's not some zero-sum, but rather, actually we share this. And can we exercise sovereignty between one or more states to the exclusion of all others as a group? Another example is the Philippine Union. This is a sort of immigration agreement between Australia and Tuvalu, but it creates what we call a plural authority. The idea is because climate migration is increasing from countries like Tuvalu, if countries do not have a community to go back to in their original country, do they still have citizenship? Do they still have rights derived from a government over a territory that may be submerged? And so Australia and Tuvalu have sat down together to sort of coordinate how their authorities would work to share citizens and to share immigration policies to provide for climate migrants. So again, it's not a perfect solution, but it gives us a new way to think about how sovereignty can be shared and coordinated between countries, potentially for the South China Sea. This isn't the only example. I have a list of other agreements that we can talk about. For the interest of time, I won't, but I really encourage you to look into these frameworks as potential alternative options for resource sharing, disaster management, or demilitarized maritime zones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Media, for this insightful presentation and highlighting the need that we need to think out of the box and face the fact that realities, also in terms of the geography, are changing, and that we need to have the mental flexibility also to include new solutions to these problems. I would now like to pass the floor to Hasib Imran, who's with Monash University in Australia. Please.
All right, thank you, Mr. Paul. So good day, everyone. My name is Hasib Imran, and I am from Monash University, and I'm going to present on you about youth power, overcoming ambiguity, and strengthening unity. So, Now, let's establish a mutual understanding about the South China Sea. First, let's talk about the strategic location. So, the South China Sea lies right at the heart of the Southeast Asia, linking the Pacific Ocean and also the Indian Ocean. It has a vast economic and resource potential, which is we have 11 million barrels of oil and also 190 trillion of cubic feet of natural gas. And then we should not forget about its environmental sustainability opportunities. And when we talk about the sustainable growth, we should talk about the blue economy. Sorry. So what is the meaning of the blue economy? So blue economy is the sustainable use of ocean resource for economic growth, which is its aim to improve livelihood and jobs, and also while preserving the health of ocean ecosystem. But before we can reach that goals, we need to talk about the dispute of the South China Sea, which is China's 9-line, which is first published in 1947, which is, you can see, in 2025 alone, 72 maritime encounters were recorded, where most involving the Philippines and Vietnam. This confrontation don't just affect the diplomacy, it also interrupt the fishing and scientific research. And the effect of this dispute are felt across different Asian countries, which is, as example, in the Philippines, which is the researchers are restricted to access to Scarborough Shoal. And this situation is not just happening in the Philippines, it also happened in other countries, which is Malaysia and also Vietnam. When access to information is limited, cooperation becomes even harder. Let's see how this data limitation create ripple effect across the whole blue economy. First, the effect is weak policy development. Second, limited marine program, and lastly, low public awareness. Data information is the foundation of good policy, environmental progress, and also public awareness. Without it, progress is halted. To overcome this situation, we must first rebuild unity both in purpose and practice. Now, let's establish mutual understanding about the meaning of unity. So, literally, the unity means the state of being joined together, which represents cooperation and collective action. But when we talk about the South China Sea context, unity means Asian countries acting collectively to protect the marine resources, which involves sharing data, technology, and also expertise. Through these countries can build a regional understanding for the future. And this inspired me to propose an idea for a youth-led initiative called the South China Sea Blue Economy Map. So, what it is, the South China Sea Blue Economy Map? It is a digital platform that combines interactive maps and real-time data. And it also aims to promote the sustainable use of ocean, which is it will visualize and centralize all the blue economy information across Asian countries, covering fisheries and marine biodiversity. And importantly, it will be a youth-led initiative. Next, about its objective, which is it will touch all the problems that I mentioned in the problem statement, which is the first one is to help policymakers design evidence blue economy strategies. Secondly, for researchers and institutions to plan effective conservation, and lastly, to build public understanding and regional trust. So this is how I envision the dashboard of interface, which is first there will be a comprehensive division where the map categorizes coastal areas into several designated blocks. Each block will be monitored and managed by local youth representatives, ensuring community-based participation. Second, each block will include a SWOT analysis. As strengths, we will have analysis of marine biodiversity and strategic parts for weakness. We will have identification of overfishing activities and waste management. For opportunities, we will talk about the exploration of offshore renewable energy potential. And lastly, the threat, which is the assessment of climate change, risk, and importantly, the ongoing territorial dispute in certain areas. And besides that, the dashboard will feature the section dedicated to humanized data and also the stories and cultural marine activities. So why we should have this section is because the platform is not only designed for policymakers and researchers, but also for the individual user, especially those interested in tourism and also local communities, Through this, we aim to raise the public awareness about the dispute in the South China Sea, while promoting understanding of its cultural and ecological richness. Now, you can see how this works, which is the implementation of the framework, which is it has a law implementation, which is we have the 8 steps here, but I will just tell it briefly, which is the first one, we have the youth mapping team. Second, we will have the data collection. The third step, which is verification. Fourth, the digital mapping. Fifth, the community stories. Sixth, the regional collaboration. Seven, policy sharing. And lastly, innovation and growth. Which in each step, there will be a youth cooperative because the specific trait that you have. Now, about the target entities and users, which is first, government agencies, second, educational institution, third, local communities, fourth, the regional organization, which is track progress toward the SDG 14 and support the regional initiative, and lastly, individual and tourists. And this is the expected impact from using this initiative, which is the first one, that we will strengthen the evidence-based policymaking. How? By regular youth dialogue, workshop, and map review meeting. Second, encourage joint conservation effort by the map identify cross-border ecological zone. And lastly, reduce misunderstanding through shared information by presenting verified data and visual stories on the blue economy map. So my final thought is, we are not supposed to see the South China Sea only as a sea of dispute, but also we need to see the South China Sea as a sea of opportunity, and I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassi, for introducing the idea of a blue economy map for the South China Sea, drawing on real-time data, and also for the detailed proposal for its implementation with a number of potential beneficiaries. That was really fascinating. Next, I would like to hand over to Daniel Kotia from the University of the Philippines in Diliman, who focuses on cartography, open data, and spatial governance. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Xin chào. For this afternoon, I would like to share my insight as a geographer, cartographer, and urban and regional planner from the Philippines. Insights on the use of geospatial technologies as an entry point for collaboration between nations in the ASEAN and the region. So, I wish to map the current geospatial strengths and charting a path towards integrated collaboration. So first, what are geospatial technologies? To review, these are tools and systems that capture and manage, analyze, and visualize location-based data to support decision-making across science, policy, and society. Use cases include urban systems, climate monitoring, maritime activities, from local, subnational, and even international scales. So it can have different components such as data acquisition, which is concerned with the gathering of data primarily through satellites and in-situ instruments. An example of this is EU's Copernicus program, in which it provides global data sets through its Sentinel satellites. Next, data infrastructure deals with the organizing and sharing of geospatial data through systems like spatial data infrastructures, promoting interoperability, access across nations. The next, data processing and analysis includes GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, in which it turns raw data into using GIS, modeling, geostatistics, supporting urban, environmental, and maritime decision-making. Then next, there is also the component of big data and computational tech, which includes emergent technology like AI, in which it leverages those processes to intensify and speed up processes in data analysis, providing baseline information at a much faster, real-time pace. The next, there is also the component of communication, in which there is no need to communicate these geospatial insights to the public, such as through digital twins, reports, story maps, and usable web and mobile apps. An example of this was in nCoV mobile web app from Vietnam in advising which areas is more concentrated with COVID-19 cases vis-a-vis mobilities. Then lastly, there is the component of human capacities, in which there is also the need to actually improve the technical capacities of planning staffs, scientists, and other policymakers. So this also ensures sustainability through training, partnerships, and technical cooperations between ASEAN institutions. Now, where is the Philippines? The Philippines actually face several major challenges. So, lack of effective leadership. So, meaning there is no unified national body overseeing geospatial governance, leading to fragmented efforts and siloed systems. Missing strategic vision means the country lacks an updated, long-term NSDI or National Spatial Data Infrastructure Master Plan that integrates both land and marine domains. No clear business case. So in the local scales, the socio-economic benefit of having geospatial investments remain undervalued and therefore not really prioritized for the legislations. Inadequate resources include limited funding, manpower, and technical capacity, which hinder the full implementation of national geospatial frameworks. Weak interoperability of data means that there is an absence of common data standards and protocols and restricts integration and sharing across agencies. And therefore, if there is a weak interoperability, there is a duplication of costs in which multiple agencies pursue overlapping interests or overlapping agendas. Therefore, what has been done by one agency is going to be pursued by another. So in hindsight, these are just some of the geospatial themes or thematic areas in which these are governed or covered separately by different Philippine agencies. So given the fragmented governance of geospatial data, this results in duplicating efforts and weak interoperability. In marine contexts, this is still very much parallel, in which there is a lack of centralized repository of data, which meant data is harder to reach and consolidate, and no clear authoritative data sets meant additional steps in verification and incompatibilities with other standard data sets. Overlapping government functions meant uncoordinated initiatives, and then with no data standards and protocols meant, again, weak interoperability of data. So the people who would be facing the difficulties here are scientists, policymakers, and even municipalities, since there are a lot of coastal municipalities in the Philippines. Now, as a result, few data sets can be described as authoritative and currently fit for purpose. Decisions are therefore often based on incomplete or incorrect evidence, leading to worsened ambiguity and uncertainty. Zooming out, in the regional scale, there are 4 subpoints in the identified needs in geospatial practices. So first, in engaging users across multiple sectors, technical support and knowledge sharing comes first. And it is also relevant in the point of leveraging innovative digital technologies. To manage data and information, geospatial data development and access, as well as the use of higher resolution satellite data is also deemed one of the most important or the most needed at the moment. Then strengthening regional partnerships is also seen as important through expert training on specific areas and regional partnerships in research and development, or R&D. So furthermore, there are some policy level gaps, such as many countries in the ASEAN region still have weak or the capacities between countries are uneven. So meaning there are varying standards and some of us have incomplete national data sets. Data sharing and stewardship practices also remain limited, hindering regional interaction of data sets. Additionally, there is a lack of technical staff in the public sector, particularly at local levels where data implementation is most needed. In the science perspective, the region faces a shortage of advanced technical skills in areas like remote sensing, machine learning and spatial data, and high resolution modeling. So data quality, coverage, and harmonization is also inconsistent, especially across marine and coastal domains, making transboundary assessment such as sea level rise or sediment flow difficult. And lastly, in the diplomatic front or diplomatic gaps, so there is a weak geospatial capacity for transboundary and diplomatic issues. So therefore, since the problems are very much real-time updating, so there is a need for the technical staff or the geospatial specialists to actually be integrated in the negotiation table or in the planning table. So furthermore, limited situational awareness tools like vessel tracking and crisis dashboards restricts ASEAN's ability to respond rapidly to regional emergencies. So if we look at other frameworks of collaboration, some of these include GeoSur in Latin America, in which this is focused on data sharing, infrastructure, and standardization to support planning, environment, and infrastructure programs between academic institutions across the Latin American countries. Copernicus of the European Union is focused on satellite or data acquisition, which includes data collection via a fleet of satellites through the Sentinel program and other in-situ sensors. The data is rate actually global. Now the next challenge is how do we contextualize and use them to different thematic use cases. So now, towards an ASEAN-wide geospatial data collaboration for the South China Sea. So this is one of what I see as the identified ways of how we can collaborate because of these following components. First, there is a transboundary sea with fragmented information. So the phenomena that we see in the sea do not really follow borders. So this includes climate impact like sea level rise, marine or sea surface temperature, marine habitats, as well as even fish stocks, as well as ship traffic. So these are actually transboundary. So common data portals, formats, and metadata standards would allow Coast Guard, scientists, and policymakers to work off the same map of reality. So currently it's difficult because there are uneven skills or capacities between member countries. So there is also the need to close the unequal technical capacities across nations. So some ASEAN countries are more skilled and some are quite trailing behind. So regional collaborations that lessen external reliance for technical capacities. And furthermore, so that we can leverage global data sets within our regional context, such as on addressing key climate-related issues such as forest fires, again sea level rise, and habitat loss. So and there is also the need to actually regionally pool resources and procuring advanced technologies and capacities. And towards a regional standard evidence-based diplomacy, so having the same authoritative data sets reduce misunderstanding and reduce diplomatic tension. So transparent data sharing reduces tension among claimant states. So shared knowledge spatial data infrastructure and shared monitoring can be a feasible entry point to transform the SCS as from a zone of contestation into a zone of collaboration. So perhaps, what would a data collaboration framework look like? First, it must be available and innovative. So there should be a joint effort at data acquisition as well as data processing analysis, similar to EU's Copernicus. So it means we have to collectively define how to process data depending on our regional needs. Then it must be highly interoperable with the national level data sets. So this would also mean there is a lot of untangling to do. So next, it must also be accessible and integrated, so meaning that there must be open data practices, so scientists and other non-state actors or non-government actors to actually work on it. So then appropriate data access, so that is something that is very much up to debate, so which data is very much ready to be shared to the whole region and which is something that has to be posited by each country that they don't really prefer. So there is really a lot of steps. So as well as visualizing interactive programs. It must be affordable, so therefore that is one thing that we're trying to gap by pooling our resources. And lastly, it shall be actionable and interdisciplinary, in which we encourage stronger partnerships with the government, academics, and private sectors, and responsive to regional issues such as our South China Sea and maritime security and climate change. So that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation that argues for an ASEAN-wide geospatial data collaboration for the South China Sea. I think it really highlighted the nuts and bolts, towards making technology more useful. And I noted that science and policy both benefit from a more integrated data set, and also that data sets should be improved to be fit for that purpose. So thank you very much again. And next we have Rupert Azzopardi from the University of Melbourne in Australia. And Rupert's research focuses on Indonesia's South China Sea policy, especially under President Prabowo. Please, Rupert.
Hello everyone, and thanks to Mr. Paul and all the attendees here today. My name is Rupert Azzopardi. I'm a Master of International Relations student at the University of Melbourne, and it's a privilege to be here at the behest of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam to present to you all. Overcoming ambiguity is part of the theme for this session. The presenters in this conference so far have shown how ambiguity has made the South China Sea more turbulent. Supposedly, if left to fester, ambiguity over maritime territory and rights will only destroy relationships in the region. Case studies do corroborate this. But does ambiguity necessitate conflict? I contend that this is not always the case. Currently, Indonesia and China enjoy a stable relationship despite their competing claims. In this presentation, I'll be tracing the deepening of the Indonesia-China relationship since 2009, which, despite numerous standoffs over maritime sovereignty in the past, is currently steady. I'd like to make clear that the views expressed in this presentation are my own. Additionally, I'm not here to tell you how to think about much debated advancements, such as Indonesia and China's joint statement, which was signed last year. Instead, I want to talk about the reality that for a decade, standoffs in the waters around the Natuna Regency occurred, and now we have not seen one for more than a year. The dispute remains unresolved. However, the process of layering the Indonesia-China relationship has actually helped insulate against conflict between these parties. Is ambiguity as a concept a complete taboo, or is it possible to blunt its edges and collaborate anyway? I'm sure we're all familiar with UNCLOS law, the basics therein. Obviously, this is the foremost legislation for maritime delineations, which both Indonesia and China have signed. I also want to emphasise the 2016 South China Sea arbitration at the Permanent Court of Arbitration to show how multiple frameworks have been used to attempt to resolve ambiguity. But despite these frameworks, the South China Sea remains a messy section of ocean, as shown in this slide, with prominent disputes over maritime territory seemingly ever present. A code of conduct eludes ratification, however, as great power rivalries, revisionism, and zero-sum approaches to territorial rights dominate the region. Without a clear path forward, some states may recognise that ambiguity may be an ever-present condition of the South China Sea. Some actors may accommodate ambiguity without the power to actually change it. Back to the map. Let's look into Indonesia and China's claims. They are relatively small. There is a lot more territory in dispute with other South China Sea claimants. The area is referred to as the Natuna waters, belonging to Indonesia's Natuna Regency. China does not claim the Natuna Islands, but some of Indonesia's exclusive economic zone in these waters falls within the 9-dash line. So I ask, does disagreement necessitate a conflict? In the South China Sea, conflicts of interest abound. It is a deeply historic maritime area with access to lucrative resources. Chowdhury et al. Argue that state claimants seek limitations in international law which harm dispute resolution efforts because, to quote, claims rely on incomplete historical data and imaginative interpretations of legal principles. States are thus incentivized to compete. However, if there are substantial differentials in capability to enforce a claim between two competing states, then the less powerful non-aligned state might seek an alternative to direct conflict. This brings me to another question, which regards a strong relationship that a state may have with a competing state. Can these relationships be forged, maintained, or improved to withstand disputes? I now return to my case study. 3 periods characterise the current Indonesian South China Sea involvement. Firstly, China officially announced the 9-dash line in 2009, establishing a formal overlap with Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. Then President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono adopted a quiet diplomacy about the South China Sea overlap, preferring to pursue a no-enemies doctrine. Meanwhile, Indonesia maintained its historic stance of non-claimant status to the broader disputes. Since Indonesia does not claim the Spratly or Paracel Island groups, which are predominant flashpoints amongst other ASEAN members, it avoids a formal conflict of interest with China. However, this has not prevented standoffs from occurring in the Natuna waters. Since 2014, Joko Widodo's presidency oversaw numerous standoffs with Chinese vessels in the area. Concurrently, this period was also characterised by increased urgency to develop Indonesia, with China emerging as a substantial force for Indonesian foreign direct investment during this time. Widodo's presidency retained an inflexible sovereignty dogma, including threatening to take China to international arbitration over its maritime resources. Tension increased, especially during the latter stages of his term, with a senior minister declaring that Indonesia would never surrender an inch of its territory. Finally, a shift occurred in November 2024 when Indonesia's current president Prabowo Subianto advanced the comprehensive strategic partnership with China in a statement that agreed to joint development in the contested waters. Since the joint statement was signed, there's not been a standoff between Indonesia and China, and instead there have been sequential meetings between key government figures from both countries, described as positive. Even though Indonesia's approach to the issue has changed over the course of 3 presidents, 2 key points remain the same. Indonesia does not define itself as an official party to the South China Sea conflict, and it does not accept the legitimacy of the 9-line claim. What remains is subject to the vicissitudes and successes of diplomacy. So why is this particular issue now not as rhetorically conflictual as that of the Philippines-China dispute? Indeed, every Indonesian president since the 9-line has denounced its legitimacy. For Indonesia, it sought to protect exclusive rights to resources, observing the opportunity cost suffered due to foreign fishing vessels operating in its exclusive economic zone. This brought it into conflict with China's historic fishing rights claim. Indonesia responded to the 9-line by sending a letter to the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf in 2010. In this letter, Indonesia's representatives dismissed China's 9-dotted lines claim as lacking international basis and is tantamount to upset UNCLOS 1982. This stance was reiterated 10 years later and also to clarify the international confusion after Prabowo signed the joint statement with China. One can look to Indonesia's bebas dan active foreign policy as an example of why Indonesia sought to stay out of the South China Sea conflict and later to mitigate the tensions when disputes arose. Indonesia seeks to approach its relationship with China as per its free and active foreign policy doctrine, in which it is imperative that Indonesia stays non-aligned and friends to all. Despite tensions, Indonesia was simultaneously actively preserving this relationship. In the joint statement signed between the two, Indonesia has clearly tried to jettison the rocky elements of the Indonesia-China relationship that the last decade had brought. Did Prabowo acquiesce to China by signing this joint statement? Many would argue, perhaps such as Attorney Gunshun, the answer is yes, but one should also assess this decision in the context of a deep layered relationship in which a mutual purpose appeared pragmatically to be beneficial. Joko Widodo was tough on incursions by illegal foreign vessels, choosing to destroy them for purposes of symbolic deterrence. In favour of economic development, fears of the loss of $20 billion from maritime poaching prompted a harsher and more active response to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. However, his presidency also had other priorities, namely investment and centering Indonesia at the axis of the Indo-Pacific. His concept of Indonesia as a global maritime fulcrum required deep engagement with interested actors in the Indo-Pacific, including China. During his presidency, China overtook Japan as a source of foreign direct investment in China. Particularly, China acknowledged the complementary nature of its Belt and Road Initiative and the global maritime fulcrum, including winning the contract for the Bandung-Jakarta high-speed railway, announcing record investment in Indonesia's maritime infrastructure, and supported business-to-business developmentalism. Meanwhile, youth ties have flourished through student exchanges. China made a concerted effort to build people-to-people ties, where, to quote Theo and Leon, students are seen as future socio-political resources who will carry out informal diplomatic functions. Students, as bearers of high expectations held by the states, institutions and society in general, build bridges when they connect internationally. In Indonesia, many of the students who studied in China have a Chinese ethnic background, enmeshing shared heritage and anchoring a mutual interest between the two countries. Indeed, I believe that many of the tenets of the Young Leaders program, the speakers in this session above, are predicated upon bridge building and contact between students and emerging professionals. I urge any attendees here to make note of the collaborative spirit of the Young Leaders presentations and engagement so far. In the interest of time, I'll brush through. We've had a few notable summits between Prabhu Subianto and Xi Jinping since Prabhu was elected inaugurated in October last year. And I will have to brush through this too. Over the turbulent waters of the South China Sea, it's the process of bridge building that bypasses the systemic issues and establishes normalcy in relations. Disputes need not become conflicts. They may be dampened into disagreements that are overwhelmed by positive diplomatic relations otherwise. Layered relations do just that. I'd also like to note that ASEAN states have their own agency, despite an overwhelming focus on their place in great power rivalry. I'd like to echo Dr. Tang Xiongmun. The interests of these states are legitimate. While there is a disciplinary preoccupation with analysis of the South China Sea at the systemic level, it is imperative that we extend our appraisals as well to the interests of other states beyond the great powers. Can the states bordering the South China Sea overcome the ambiguity of their competing claims in the region? Possibly not. But that does not necessitate escalation. Indonesia and China demonstrate that relationships may be normalised and developed in spite of competing claims in the South China Sea. Thank you, that is all.
For zooming in on one case of overlapping claims and interests, in this case Indonesia and China, and the balancing act that is implied in it, managing but still staying firm on one's own interests. And I think this is a very good example of how we all need rigorous academic study and analysis of case studies to extrapolate for other cases and what it means for the wider region. And regarding the quote that you brought up on the screen, I think students in this forum as well are already fulfilling informal diplomatic functions, such as you and the young leaders who are joining today. And I think I very much welcome that contribution in this sense as well. So now I would like to thank our four speakers for keeping to the time. I think we're doing very well on time. And open the floor for questions to our presentations. Okay, I see quite a few hands here. The two ladies, second row from the back, please. Yeah.
My name is Kim Ji from Young Leader Programs. I have the questions for Mr. Imran. In your presentations, you mentioned about the importance of data sharing, and I have questions for you in that how can you encourage the country to share their accurate data to your platform? Yeah, thank you.
And please pass it on to your neighbor.
Okay. Hello, I'm Sunny Sunyi, and I'm the participant from Young Leader Programs. And I have a question for Mr. Imran, sorry. You mentioned about your application about sharing data. I think it's relying heavily on data, right? And as a computer science student, I have a kind of technical question for you. You collect a variety of data from open source, from local story, from trade, from renewable energy. So I want to ask, how can you combine all the data, and what's your and how can you standardize your information so that it can create a reliable data for, especially in the disputed maritime zone or sensitive zone? Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll pass it on to the middle section of the same block.
All right, but I have one mic. Thank you. Right. So I am Mai from the DAV Captain Young Leaders Program. I have some questions for Ms. Nitya, Mr. Hasif, Mr. Daniel Kotia, and also Mr. Rupert. Sorry. Regarding Ms. Nitya, your presentation centers on the baseline. I recently read the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. I also understand the problem between freezing the problem of freezing the baseline means that the island people, especially small islands of the South Pacific, they might be displaced when sea level rise. it covers their land. So there will be displacement. So I would like to hear your comments on that. Second thing is that in the definition of the island in the UN clause, it said that the island has to be naturally formed with their population, with economic life. So semi-population, like armed presented there, they should not be as counted as island. But I can see that they are still building island activity. And there are some countries that are sending people to build economic life there. So would this mean that over time there will be an evolutive interpretation of the definition of island? Because the island itself is now being built and it's bigger and it has population there. Although not originally there, it was being sent there, but over time it will create economic life. So will this be a sign of evolutive interpretation of the definition of island? Another question for Mr. Hasif Imran, and I want you guys and Mr. Daniel Kotia to answer together, to comment on each other. I understand that the data is really important, especially in geospatial and in sharing the data, but the core problem lies in accessibility to those areas because there are competing claims, right? But I understand that you want to improve the credibility by cooperating, but this is a problem of access to these islands because they have to go to those places to access to primary data, primary information. So will YouthLed be sufficient for that? And so yeah, and the institutional barrier of developing might be the institutional burden might be too much for just the YouthLed. So will there be international cooperation between ASEAN countries with each other to avoid the fragmentation problem? There might be 10 initiatives, but it might be better to just have one large initiative to avoid fragmentation. Sorry for taking time. The last question is directed to Mr. Rupert. I understand that diplomacy between Indonesia and China will be very effective to sort out the competing claims in the South China Sea. I understand that diplomacy can be my question will be, will diplomacy be the sorting catalyst to the ripple effect, because to the ripple effect of the competing claims in this, because alright, yeah. So diplomacy can it become a soothing catalyst for the ripple effect of the severe diplomatic tension between countries because of the claim in South China Sea. And this is not a question, but I want you to clarify on why you said that Indonesia is not a party to South China Sea conflict. I understand conflict, and I want you to clarify further because maybe I couldn't make it out very well. The South China Sea conflict might be different from the South China Sea dispute, and it might be different from South China Sea claims because the definition of dispute in a normative case, it is the disagreement on a fact. So can you clarify on that? Because you said that it is not a party, it means it quite does not make sense out to me. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the record, I think, for a number of questions posed in one go. And I think we'll take a couple more questions also from the same area. Please, the lady in white first. Please.
Hello, my name is Han and I am from the Young Leaders Program. My question is directed to Nitya. I was really impressed by your suggestion of collective sovereignty. However, regarding the region where there has been a lot of conflict and tension for not just recently, but it's more historical, I wanted to be able to clarify your idea of collective sovereignty. My first question is, how does this resolution take into account the distinctive national interests and government systems? And are climate disasters like the only glue that is holding this solution together? And secondly, if there was a collective sovereignty, is it the individual states, claimants, or is it regional institutions like ASEAN that will hold this resolution together? And my third question is, how does it take into account the power asymmetry, where China's larger economy and resources might be a coercive factor influencing this collective governance? Thank you.
Thank you you very much. And I think we'll take the two gentlemen next to Han. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Megan, and I'm also one of the Young Leader program. My question is directed to Rupert. So I keep my question short in regard to global maritime fulcrums. Is there any continuity from the principle that's set by Joe Biden to the current administrations of Prabowo Subianto? Thank you. Any continuities in terms of the global maritime fulcrum into the current administrations of Subianto?
Okay, and last question for this round, please.
Yeah, first of all, let me extend my early congratulations. I think you to my fellow young leaders, I think your contributions are equally outstanding. My question goes to Rupert as well. I think I will just keep it short and crisp. You know, with all the pragmatic progress that you mentioned earlier about Indonesia and China relations, how do you see the caudal effects to the ASEAN? Because as you mentioned earlier, the free and active foreign policy has contributed so much to the grand designs of, Indo-Pacific, through the global maritime axis. There's also another normative force that becomes the body of ASEAN Charter, the consultations and consensus decision-making, or what we call in our country is musyawarah and mufakat. My question is, with all these pragmatic progresses, do you foresee that Indonesia can rebound as a normative leader in the code of conduct exercise, in the future as it progresses? Again, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much for these fascinating questions, and I would like to pass it on in this order. Please, Nadia, you can go first.
Thank you so much. Those are a lot of questions. I'll try my best to address them all. First, on the ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, the real question that they sought to address was whether or not smaller states are sort of entitled to climate reparations in some way for adaptation. And so it's not exactly related, but when we come to that question of climate displacement, which is very acute for the South Pacific, it's why I used the example of the Australia Tuvalu Filipino Union case, where climate displacement is a problem, particularly for Pacific Islands, but will very much be the case for coastal regions around the world in the future. And they are creating layered approaches to sovereignty. So it's not completely unprecedented and actually a model that should be examined further. It's not the only one, but I think because it's a recent case, it shows the trajectory that this is going in and a direction that we can move in. To your question about evolving definitions of islands, it's important to remember that international law is really centered on the principle of stability. So it's not suddenly going to change to try to accommodate new definitions of islands. In fact, that's exactly what the Arbitral Tribunal did not do. And so what does stability mean is the real question. If stability means we uphold the principle of ambulatory boundaries, then boundaries will naturally shift, as has been the case for decades. But if stability means preserving boundaries where they are, then fictitious or imaginary boundaries become the trend. And suddenly we don't have as much precedent for how to enforce or deal with these things. So it's not that we should legitimize island building processes, but we run into the limits of international law in governing interactions, and we need new ways or frameworks to govern our engagements at sea. And then to the questions about collective sovereignty, the history and national interests, is climate the only unifying factor? Who enforces it? Larger economies will be coercive. I may not be able to answer all of that in one sitting, but no, climate is not the only unifying factor in terms of uncertainty and how we address the South China Sea. Natural resources, fisheries, search and rescue zone cooperation, disaster mitigation, there is so much more there, let alone engagement and collaboration with youth. And so there's a lot that unifies the South China Sea going forward. It need not be climate, but I thought that was a really good example. In terms of larger economies that could be coercive, and how does collaboration actually work? Who enforces it? I think the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning Center is sort of a good example here, where when it comes to search and rescue zone and awareness about maritime risk, one country having a bigger navy is not a detriment to another. In fact, it's an advantage in that if you're sharing information about maritime domain awareness, your capabilities are equally an extension of another's as long as you're collaborating. And so we need not think of this as a zero-sum game, but actually, if we all want to preserve sustainable fisheries management, then it's in our collective interest not to have one person fish over another, but actually to come up with some sort of licensing agreements or sharing agreements that allow us to prevent overfishing as a tragedy of the commons collective action problem. And so this isn't about one country's capabilities over another, but actually how all countries can sort of share the same capabilities to their advantage.
Thank you very much, and I would like to pass on now to Hasif. There were a few questions about how to share data accurately, open source, standardization, but please go first and then Daniel.
So the first question is about how we can encourage the youth to share accurate data. So for this question, we need to go back to the start in the initiative, which is we have the 8 step in it. Which is the third step is the verification, which is in the verification we have the expertise from each country to make sure that the data is accurate, and besides that we will choose the youth that have actually the academic background for this initiative. And then the second question about how can we standardize the data. So first of all, we need to understand that this initiative is in the introductory phase. So the standardization will happen after several meetings, or when this initiative itself have their own identities. It will come after time we have our own meeting, which is the youth actually meet together and talk about it. And I think that's all for me.
Hello. So perhaps let me address the question on how do we, these are actually, the South China Sea is very much a frontier for most countries there. So it's a frontier for the Philippines, far in the west, for Vietnam, far in the east. So it's quite very far. And I would agree that getting primary data perhaps through actual going to those locations is difficult. Hence, the solution, or rather the necessity that is provided by geospatial data through satellite imageries or other remote sensing techniques, or even in situ sensors, and this actually includes military sensors and other observation sensors that can be installed on the islands. But perhaps let's focus on satellite imageries. So first of all, satellite imageries there are a lot of globally or freely, openly available datasets that are global in coverage. These actually include bathymetry, this can actually include differences in or changes in marine or sea surface temperature, or even sea surface waves. So there are a lot of datasets. Perhaps what is needed now by the ASEAN as a regional bloc is to actually, I would actually agree with your statement that there is actually the need, or actual necessity, for one large institution that actually consolidates our national or regional efforts in advancing our geospatial capabilities. So perhaps I would like to echo Dr. Nguyen Trang's position earlier on climate security as a fourth pillar for the ASEAN, since the ASEAN region is one of the most climately vulnerable regions, and therefore to treat climate as a security issue is an imperative. Furthermore, with regards to having a one large institution, there are then again institutional frameworks that where we can use as a launching pad for some kind of a collective geospatial data infrastructure across the region. So some of the mentioned include ASEAN Center for Climate Change, or AHA Center, or for humanitarian assistance. So going back, so I think now the question now is how do we actually utilize this wealth of satellite imageries, and how do we actually have them verified, or how can we say that they're actually accurate? That's where collaboration comes in. So there are a lot of methodologies treating different data sets depending on definitely use cases, and hence data acquisition, or capturing the satellite images, is one, treating them and analyzing them and actually interpreting them is another. Hence, those processes of processing as well as interpretation is the one that should be standardized. Hence, there are just clear indices or metrics that can be measured or identified across a given space. So with that, I would also take that chance to reiterate that having one institution in the ASEAN level would actually accelerate our efforts, given that there are also two other very rapidly developing things, which is climate change, sea level rise, happening by the day, by the year, by the decade, and the rapid technological advancement with AI and other emergent technologies, which has uses in, particularly in data and satellite images. Hence, I do believe that we have to actually pool our resources and consolidate our efforts, and this goes as far as having shared data standards, and even as far as actually taking the steps from EU of having actually a shared space data related agencies, as well as higher forms of collaborations between our respective national space agencies and counterparts. So, yeah.
Thank you, and I would like to pass it on to Rupert now. There were a few questions about the Indonesia-China case study. Can this be a catalyst? Why is Indonesia not a party to the South China Sea conflict? And can Indonesia have a normative role? And we also have a question on the screen that I would like you to consider as well, so please go ahead.
For sure. I'll get to the question on the screen last. To answer if diplomacy will be a catalyst for a ripple effect of resolutions or periods of peace in the South China Sea, I don't want to universalize. The reason I focused on a specific case is to give detail to the Indonesian example. I'm not looking to extrapolate this to the Filipino or the Vietnamese example as well. I do aim to provide a case study of the conflict resolution, as I said, and a call to action. So I think that there is absolutely nothing to be lost by layering your relations, deepening your relations between two states, and I think that in the case of the study I provided, it really did a wonderful job of insulating against the conflict. As I said, there was a number of standoffs during the 2010s between Indonesia and China. Now, since the joint statement was signed, there hasn't been one. So a strong relationship in this case does correlate. I won't universalise, but I think that it would be a very helpful way forward for a lot of actors, a lot of claimants in the South China Sea. A few of the questions I'm going to kind of answer a little bit together because there is a bit of a common theme. Satra asked if Indonesia will emerge as a normative leader. I think it already has. That's kind of why this case study matters in particular, I think. I think Indonesia took a pretty senior role during the 1990s in negotiations and mediations between claimants. The Global Maritime Fulcrum, which has since been dispensed with, it really aimed to establish Indonesia at this centre of not only Southeast Asia but also of the entire Indo-Pacific, with the two oceans, I guess, meeting at the confluence in Jakarta. And there's a pretty succinct phrase from an academic named Anwar, in which he describes Indonesia as leading from behind. In ASEAN, obviously, it's difficult to say that there's such thing as a outright leader. It's a pretty much an equality-based organisation. Indonesia has a substantial economy, the largest in ASEAN and the largest population in ASEAN. So without taking the formal leadership, Indonesia seeks to lead from behind. That's why it refuses to partake in the South China Sea disputes, or in the South China Sea conflict. Because it seeks to lead from behind, it it establishes its dispute on the premise that China claims the Natuna waters. Jokowi in 2017 established the waters north of the Natuna Regency Islands as the North Natuna Sea, similar to the West Philippine Sea designation. Indonesia and China completely agree that the Natuna Islands are Indonesian territory. The dispute lies over a block of maritime territory that sits within Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. This also allows Indonesia to pursue its foreign policy doctrine of vivus non active better if it accepts that it is a claimant within the South China Sea dispute conflict, then it can't activate a free and active foreign policy as easily as it had. And finally, just to answer the online question, do you think the relatively limited scope of overlapping maritime claims created more favourable conditions for cooperation, thereby making it easier to advance the bilateral relationship in the way you described? In short, no. I think, as I said, it's a pretty significant case study based off the implications for the rest of ASEAN. I think that Indonesia had unique requirements throughout the 2010s that offset the standoffs that it was having with China. Concurrently, those standoffs were pretty severe, and they even bled into the 2020s as well. So there was a standoff over the oil rigs in the 2020s, in which the USS Reagan monitored this activity, this incident. I think it is a pretty substantial and significant case study, despite such a small overlap. So I think it is a challenging one diplomatically to resolve, and I think that a period of layering those international relationships helped to insulate against conflictual stances. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. And as this was the Young Leaders panel, the Young Leaders also took precedence in asking questions, but now I would very much like to invite the senior experts in the room to ask questions and challenge our panelists a little more. Please, anybody from Dr. Hai, let's start with you.
Thank you, Deborah. And, my name is Dr. Hai, I'm from the DAV. So I really appreciate your research and also insightful presentations. I thought some very provocative questions. My observation is that the humanity have a very important inventions, that the concept of sovereignty, that solved many problems in the past and helped the world prevent many countries, many wars and conflicts. At the same time, we have here also have the old problem as well. So, of course, the idea is that we leave the South China Sea dispute for the next generation to resolve. So I think that the Chinese leadership mentioned many times that we should leave it for the next generation. So congratulations, you have all in your court. So if you have a chance to revise the concept of sovereignty, so how would you revise it so that we could limit the negative impact of that concept on our humanity and our world? Thank you. Then I just want the question for you all. It's okay, all the panelists. Thank you.
Great. I see a lady in the back over there.
Thank you for the representative from the youth generation. I have a question. We are living in this information age, and we see some challenges from information warfare, contradicting this will, how to say, make it more, how to say, can increase this kind of extremism, division among the young people. Because maybe you are very prone to this kind of emotional feelings or the young sentiment. So do you have any proposal or ideas or any suggestions that you can overcome this kind of division to strengthen the unity of the young people, especially on this South China Sea and other regional conflicts or disputes in general? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's take a question here at the back, please.
Good evening, my name is Sui and I have a question for Mr. Daniel Kozia. And your idea of geospatial data sharing is very great, it's very innovative, but at present the geospatial capacity and technology of each country are not at the same level. So which ASEAN countries do you think will take the lead in developing the system and coordinating the sharing of geospatial data? Thank you.
And we have a couple more questions here in the center, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Ching. I'm from the National Border Commission of the former official. And I have a comment and a question to Mr. Rupert. Because you have given a case study about Indonesia and China. I think we can also give another case study, which is the maritime delimitation in the Gulf Tonkin between Vietnam and China. Actually, as mentioned by Professor Lee, China erased 2 dashes in the South China, in the Gulf Tonkin. This year we are commemorating the 25th anniversary of the signing of the agreement on maritime delimitation in the Gulf Tonkin. And I think at the outset, the 2 countries agreed on the main principle to follow to design the maritime delimitation in the Gulf Tonkin, and it was fully in conformity with the provision of the UNCLOS 1982. So I think it might be a good case study for other settlements of conflict or disputes in the South China Sea. So it means that it is possible to erase the rest of the dashes and to just apply fully the provision of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and would it be considered as some surrendering the spirit and the principle of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea regarding the maritime delimitation? Why you actually surrounded your sovereign rights and jurisdiction as recorded in the convention? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll take one last question, please, over there. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name is John from the DAV. Because our speakers are young, so I have a kind of innovative questions. So we can suppose that you become a structure in the South China Sea. You witnesses all the things happening in thousands of years, the distinctions of species, the oil rigs and the oilings of the ships, and also the ships traveling, making friends with each other, and the fightings as well. So what would you like to talk to the humans? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a fascinating set of questions. We have a few questions, I believe, that were addressed to all panelists, and I would like to save that for last. But we also have a couple of questions that were addressed specifically to Daniel and to Rupert. So Daniel, would you like to answer to your question first?
Hello. So, to have some bit of a landscape on where the ASEAN countries currently are now in terms of having geospatial and space technology. So, for the past years, several countries have actually built their respective space agencies. The Philippines has its own Philippine Space Agencies. Thailand has GIST, or the Geoinformatics and Space Technology Agency, Development Agency. So I do think of some of the countries that could actually lead the consolidation of data standardization or data infrastructure deployment across the whole ASEAN region could be perhaps Thailand, who has actually had an experience in trying to consolidate data, their respective data and statistics from different siloed practices in the different ministries down to a much more coherent and much more consolidated under the GISTTA. So yeah, that's one of my answers to that. Albeit I would foresee that there is also quite a lot of challenges in doing that since, of course, we're talking about 11 countries right now, which definitely each have their own contextual uses of geospatial data and even different practices in administrative allocation or levels. So in the Philippines, we even have the barangay level, or in Vietnam, they have communes, or there are different ways of actually dividing the land in subnational divisions. So yeah, but then again, I do believe it really boils down into some kind of a collaborative arrangements. Perhaps that is something that can be, just like it is said that it can be chairman every periodically by different relevant agencies or scientific agencies between each countries. So yeah.
Thank you. And Rupert, on the case of the Gulf of Tonkin delimitation agreement and parallels to the case study you presented.
Yes, that's a very interesting case study. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. The notion of erasing dashes from the dashed line claim is when you mentioned that it did it sounds like progress. Of course, I completely agree. I worry that was 25 years ago. As you said, the 25th anniversary. I worry that the nature of the great power conflict that has emerged now has meant that concessions are a bit of a thing of the past for great powers. I worry that a step back represents a big loss of prestige, and I say with a touch of pessimism that I don't think that there is a likelihood of more dashes being erased without a notable change in the dynamic in the South China Sea.
Thank you. And lastly, we also have a direct question to Lydia on the screen. So please, before we have the final round of questions to all.
Sure. So the question says, why do some states and scholars support the assumption of ambulatory boundaries, while others, for instance, Pacific Islands, advocate for fixed baselines? And which approach is appropriate for the South China Sea, particularly Vietnam? So I think it's really important to establish that ambulatory boundaries are not an assumption. That is international law. That is the case law. That is the precedent. And so it is universal under international law that our boundaries are supposed to shift as the coastline shifts. Why? Because when we were negotiating UNCLOS, we never thought our boundaries were going to move so fundamentally as a result of technological innovation in land reclamation or in climate change. So we could not have foreseen that, and so this question was never supposed to come up. But now we're here today, and it exists. And so, for the Pacific Islands in particular, that reality becomes intolerable when an atoll is a few meters across and only 2 or 3 meters above sea level. And so as the impacts of climate change persist, if you trace the sort of long-term trajectory of that for Pacific Islands, it assumes that if their boundaries are ambulatory, they could disappear by international law standards. And we don't have anything in international law that accounts for that. Is there such thing as a submerged state? Do those states still exist? Do they still have rights? Where do their people go? Are they still entitled to seats in international bodies? To whom are their debts owed if they are no longer participants in the international system? So there needed to be some way to create stability against a future that we never anticipated. And as a result, the Pacific Islands created the Pacific Boundaries Project, where they fixed their baselines. But again, this is a common law, informal practice, assumed among the Pacific Islanders as their own consensus. Will larger states transiting through this region respect that practice? That is the question. And realistically, in a zero-trust environment, that's not guaranteed. So, what is the best approach for the South China Sea? It's not that fixing baselines is the solution. And where we don't have clear sovereignty delineations, we can't really fix something that isn't there yet. But from an environmental perspective, the Pacific Islands geography is not that different than the small features across the South China Sea. And we may not be paying attention to what's happening in the Pacific Islands, but they will foreshadow what we face here in the South China Sea. And so, it's not that we should stick to what ambulatory means in international law. It's not that we need to fix our baselines. It's that we don't really know what stability means. It's not defined. And so we should struggle with that question. We should come up with an answer, but it doesn't exist yet. It's not going to come from the international law we have. We're not making progress that way. And that's why I proposed newer concepts. Maybe we can innovate a little bit here.
Thank you very much for that clear-cut answer. And now to the more open-ended questions that are slightly challenging, perhaps. We had a question about how to revise the concept of sovereignty, and we had a question about how to tackle disinformation, the problem of disinformation, and then also what sort of advice would you give for the future if you could implement some sort of short-term change, what would it be? And let's go in the order that we started with. So please, Nadia, choose one of those or answer to all of them, and we'll pass it on to Rupert.
Sure. So to the sort of fun question on how would you redefine or create new sovereignty, I actually think that we should probably push past this concept of zero-sum sovereignty and try something different. Could we break down our interactions in the South China Sea based on negotiated rights and access? So we assume fundamentally that almost everyone transits through this body of water, which is true if anyone's ever looked at ship tracks. There's the Svalbard Fisheries Agreement from the 1920s in Europe, and basically it assumes that a section of the Arctic belongs to Norway where there's a sovereignty dispute. But fisheries rights are negotiated and limited among multiple states. In Antarctica, the Antarctic Treaty, there is actually no sovereignty over Antarctica by any one state. Yet we collaborate on science and technology so that everyone has the right and the access as it needs. So what if we stop focusing so much on mine versus yours and focus more on who has rights and how do we operate collaboratively? I think that is probably more true to the reality at sea. And then to the question about social media and youth online, I'm not so pessimistic about social media. I mean, at least 2 people on this panel were recruited based on social media, so it doesn't mean that it has to be divisive. It can actually bring people together. Whether it was the Arab Spring or these Gen Z movements, Actually, social media can be a unifying and mobilizing force, especially for youth who are particularly engaged online. But also, online is not always reality. And so for young people, the challenge is, can you be brave enough to look up from your phone, maybe fly to Vietnam within less than 12 hours of getting a visa, or be an American who moves abroad to China and be willing to talk to the other people around the world. So yes, there is a risk of disinformation, but I don't think we're doomed.
Thank you. Hasif, please.
So I'm going to answer the question about what can we do to strengthen the unity between youth in South China Sea. So first of all, we need to understand that that youth have that specific trait that can be really helpful to strengthening the unity, which is they are really open to engage. But the problem is we can see that they doesn't have the true platform to engage, which is this is the situation which is we need to create that platform, which is we can create more platform for dialogue and collaboration, such as joint youth forum and also cultural exchange and environmental project, which is I already explained in my presentation, which is we can do the blue economy map initiative, which is by this initiative we can actually make all of the Southeast Asia youth that have that effort to be together and also work together to go to aim the same goals. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Hello. So actually, I'm quite rather how do I say this? I'm quite rather fascinated with the question on what if we revise, or in the past we revised the concept of sovereignty. So initially it's quite a big question, although I tried to explore what is sovereignty anyway in the first place, and then there's concepts of actually governments being able to actually govern for themselves, their territories are actually respected, their borders are respected. But at the same time, I recall that those concepts were actually developed even the post-colonial context, especially in the ASEAN region, in which, at least in the time when borders aren't exactly a concept for states, so apparently our foreign or European colonizers just went on to actually explore the islands, and in some places, and eventually most of the places actually established their respective authorities, their hands, escaping to the 20th century, trying to develop different institutions and frameworks to actually protect the rather newly born states. So I am rather finding it difficult to find ways to actually perhaps reconceptualize it given our current web of problems in the South China Sea, when it's actually rooted in having different claims. So one actually has a claim of having 9-9s, and the other is actually trying to base it on international rules or through the basis on the exclusive economic zone. So I do believe it's something that we actually try to work on along the way as an international body, trying to improve our institutions, because of course even our forefathers, they don't really knew best, right? So it's definitely something that we improve along the way. And as for the information warfare, I'd like to talk about it in a much more perspective as a geographer or someone who actually deals with maps. So there are a lot of disinformation or intentional misinformation that is done to actually confuse the public using maps. So I think there is one, pardon me, it's just somewhere on social media that actually includes the island of Palawan as actually part of the 9-9. So the audit is probably among the mainland Chinese, I'm not so sure. But nonetheless, of course, we Filipinos are like, are you really sure about that? So I think to actually solve this information, at least in this kind of perspective, what the public would need, or at least perhaps first as a perspective of Filipinos, to actually have some fundamental facts to to be actually communicated clearly and concisely to the public. So ever since our efforts in the UNCLOS Arbitral Award, we have, or at least I was a youth or a much younger youth back then, we were communicating that these are our territories since this is within our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So I think conciseness and clarity as well as permanence of the concepts would actually help dispel disinformation, the multitude of disinformation in the information.
I'll try and keep this a little bit briefer, but to revise sovereignty, I did like what Nitya brought up about almost sovereignty sharing arrangements. A particular case study close to home includes the Torres Strait Treaty between Torres Strait Islander Australians and traditional landowners in Papua New Guinea. This allows historical traditional fishing and sort of trade activities to occur across these islands and across this waterway. I guess in the South China Sea, the South China Sea and its history not only precedes UNCLOS, it also precedes the notion of the nation state. People have been fishing and trading and interlinking there for millennia, and I think that we should consider the role of a traditional usage condominium in which, first of all, that would be very good for the environment. I think if we dropped down the overfishing element down and allowed more of a traditional approach to fishing there, but I think that would be very helpful. And disinformation, I am a firm believer that we need more people-to-people ties. I think honest conversations between not just youth and also not just university-educated youth. I think that we're very fortunate to be up here and have these sort of conversations, but I think that the results of these conversations can get locked away sometimes in our circles, in the halls of knowledge of universities and so on. I think that such opportunities should be given to increase culture-to-culture knowledge outside of university. And a very short-term solution, I think, for the South China Sea, I think that I'd like to see would be an ASEAN minilateral, exclusively using the claimants and the People's Republic of China. That would be it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And since we're already running slightly over time, I think what remains for me to do is to thank our four excellent speakers. I think this was a very inspiring last session and a worthy end to a fascinating conference. And please join me in giving a big round of applause to our young leaders in this forum.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we have reached the conclusion of our two-day conference, encompassing 6 sessions and one special round of dialogue. May I now kindly invite Dr. Nguyễn Hùng Sơn, President of Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, to deliver the closing remarks. Dr. Sơn, the floor is yours.
Well, Excellencies, distinguished guests, scholars, moderators, friends and colleagues, it has been a terrific 2 days of conference with a lot of beautiful, bright, provocative, but very useful ideas. We discussed a lot the uncertainties. We talked about realities, perceptions of realities. We discussed about narratives and counter-narratives. We talked about rules and gaps in the rules. And we discussed gray zones and how to counter gray zones. We talked about facts, about fakes and fabrications. And we discussed transparency and assertive transparencies and the limits of transparencies. We discussed major powers, and we debated the notions of a G2 world, and we discussed where the South China Sea fits in such a world. We talked about strategic signaling, strategic communications, and we discussed commitments as well as determinations and resolves. And also we talked about stability, strategic stabilities, and detente, and so on and so forth. We talked about intra-regional countries, and we discussed extra-regional countries, and we talked about their motivations and whether or not one should take side, and if taking side or not taking side would be seen as provocations. And we even talked about dead red lines. And of course, tech discussion is always present in today's geopolitical discussions, and we had a wonderful session on tech with a lot of ideas on why tech can be helpful, but why tech can also create uncertainties. We talked about rules, attributions, the relations between rules and text, and so on. And on the second day, I think we had we kick-started with Ambassador's Lounge, consisting of the so-called middle powers countries and countries that aspire to be middle powers, and that was Vietnam. And we discussed how the middle powers can help in providing and consolidating or helping with unifying or promoting unity. And we found that there could be a lot of ideas, and there could be a lot of areas where the middle powers can play a role in helping manage the uncertainties and promoting unity. And that was trade, that was solidifying and enforcing international law, that's building the capacity, protecting critical infrastructure, protecting critical supply chains, and so on. We talked about multilateralism, didn't we? And we debated a lot on plurilateralism, unilateralism, and where ASEAN can be more helpful, and how ASEAN can be more helpful. And of course, we talked, we did mention about the recent signing of the Cyber Convention that Vietnam as a country hosted. And that would give us some hope that multilateralism actually still work. And there are, while there are reasons to worry about the challenges that is posing towards multilateralism, there's also hope that multilateralism can unite us all. There was a lot of ideas about how ASEAN can be more helpful, and we talked about ASEAN serving as a conciliator, as a mediator, as a fact finder, fact checker, and there actually could be a lot of ways that ASEAN can be made more useful in this increasingly uncertain world. Of course, we talked at length about, well, in fact, every single session in today's conference talked about international law, the rules-based international order, and UNCLOS was featured prominently in all of those discussions. And it should be so, because we talk We are talking about the South China Sea. And to strengthen UNCLOS, there were a lot of ideas, and I will not do any justice in summarizing those ideas because I know the legal experts did a wonderful job in proposing those ideas. But we did talk about the code of conduct, and the code of conduct is seen in very different manners. If it is a legal tool, or is a political tool, if it is a means towards an end, or it's actually an end itself. And there were a lot of ideas on how we should approach the code of conduct at this very stage. And there was a lot of hope that the Philippines can be a booster to help the code of conduct, at least somehow, in the year to come when they handle the chair, knowing that Malaysia still is the country coordinator of ASEAN-China's relation. And of course there were a lot of talks about climate change, AI and tax in respect to international law. But there was one thing that were mentioned, and that is in this very uncertain world, in this world of transformation, awareness, knowledge is power. And there was a lot of views that understanding is a first step in responding and resolving uncertainties. Understanding gray zones, there were some views, is a response to gray zone itself. Was that your idea, Ray? And so there were a lot of proposals that dialogues such as this one and capacity building in order to promote understanding is very essential in building unity and in responding to uncertainties. But there were a question about, so we are seeking unity, but what does unity mean? And we all agree that unity doesn't have to be uniformity, and differences does not deny unity. In fact, differences and how to deal with differences is part of building unity. And I would like to commend the young leaders who have done great work in looking at what unity means. And there was this proposal that we can build unity by promoting collectivity, promoting a sharing of ideas, and promoting common regional understanding. I think those are very useful definitions of unity and how we can build unity. So these are just some of the highlights that I'd like to share with you, and those are my personal highlights. This is not meant to be a summary of the very rich discussions that we've had over the last 2 days. I encourage you to draw your own findings and draw your own highlights and share it with us if possible, because we'd like to learn what you've learned in the past 2 days. And share with us your feedback as well about the conference, about the content of the conference, about how we can better organize the conference in the years to come. So, maybe we should, as an outcome of this conference, build a bank of innovative ideas on the South China Sea. And the DAV would be a good depository of such ideas. So if you would like to contribute to the bank, just send me and send us your ideas. So now we have come to the conclusion of the conference. I have nothing else to say but to thank all of you for coming all the way to Vietnam. Some of you coming from very far. Some of you missed the time. Some of you missed the flight. But you eventually still made it here. And I really treasure your determination. And that shows how much you care about this region and how much you care about the South China Sea. So I'd like to thank all of you, distinguished moderators, panelists, young leaders, participants, for your enthusiasm and active engagement. Despite the somehow challenging weather in Da Nang, the conference still remained full And I say absolutely full. Every single seats were taken, and we had to even provide extra seats on day 2. Thank you very much for that. I especially would like to extend my thanks to the young leaders. You have always been a fantastic part of the conference, so please come back next year and the years to come. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the local government of Da Nang and the people of Da Nang for their warm welcome and hospitality. I'd like to thank our dedicated partners, including the Vietnam Lawyers Association, the Foundation for East Sea Studies, the embassies of Australia, Embassy of the United Kingdom, Embassy of Canada in Hanoi, Embassy, the European Union delegation, Vietnam Australia Center, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the ICWA Plus project. Your unwavering support has helped elevate the South China Sea Conference into one of the region's rather prominent platform for dialogue and cooperation. I'd also like to thank our interpreters who have been working so hard to help all carry the full meaning of our conversation. Thank you. I'd like to thank the media as well. They have been working hard in order to make our conversation and our great ideas known to the broader public who are not able to participate in person. So thank you, all the medias. And last but not least, I would like to recognize my dear colleagues at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Your months of hard work and dedication and quiet resilience behind the scenes, like the undertow beneath the calm waters, have made this conference a success. We all can be proud of yourself. Thank you, dear leaders. So thank you once again, and I hope that we have spared you some time and you also give you some time to explore the beautiful sceneries of Da Nang, the beautiful and hospitality of the people of Da Nang. And wherever you go, I wish you a safe flight home, and we do look forward to welcome you back to Vietnam, to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, as well as to the South China Sea conferences in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyễn Sơn. Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests, our 17th South China Sea International Conference has officially concluded, but our shared efforts continues. For our on-site participants, please scan the QR code on screen to share your feedback. Your input is invaluable. For our online audience, feel free to connect to us via our social media channels for follow-up materials and video commentaries. Thank you once again for your participation and insights. We wish you all a pleasant evening, and we're looking forward to seeing you next year. Thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, maybe my car will be sunny there.
Follow